What's going on? Welcome back to Theme Deck Tuesday, and as you can see, welcome to the top 10 best theme decks that are out there right now, and kind of an overview of the metagame, if you will. This is a little bit of a different format from my typical videos, as there won't be any gameplay. This is just a showcase of all of the top 10 best decks, so if that's something that you're interested in, be sure to watch till the end, as this is going to be in reverse order. Now if we get into the rankings here and kind of talk over the introduction of how I went about ranking these various theme decks, it is very important to note that this isn't just all based on my own opinions, although it is very much heavily focused on that, but I have also taken into consideration the fact that there is a metagame, so we're going to be looking at how popular these decks are, as well as just in general how strong they are and how well these decks draw through the cards that they have available to them. So all of these factors are going to contribute and combine into the rankings themselves. So if you don't see your deck is particularly high compared to where you think it might be, that's just because I've taken into account all of these different factors here. So without further ado, I don't want to waste too much time on each deck, as this is just an overview, and you can always go into the playlist linked in the description down below, where you can find a full breakdown of each of these decks along with other theme decks that I've looked at in the past. Starting off then, we do have the number 10 place is going to be given to Torrential Cannon, which is the deck featuring Blastoise, which came out in Team Up. This is an excellent deck and mainly makes its way into the top 10 thanks to the top tier decks being mostly fire decks, so that gives you a little bit of a clue as to what those decks might be. But yeah, the water weakness, being able to hit for that against those top decks is very good, as well as the fact that it has some very good consistency cards in here through the means of like energy acceleration, and we also just have good draw in general. But some of the weak points, it definitely does miss knockouts at some key times, and it does have a limited amount of attackers. As you can see in the deck list here, it is very much focused on that Blastoise. It does have the Pidgeotto line there to get the consistency up, but you're either going to be attacking with that Blastoise or the Golduck for the most part. And if your Blastoise goes down or you can't set it up, you're really going to struggle. Going into our number 9 spot then, we do have the Rillaboom theme deck. This is a very underrated theme deck, but that's mainly due to the fact that it can be somewhat inconsistent and really the main flaw if you ask me. But the other main flaw is, of course, it is weak to fire since it is a mostly grass-based deck. We do have some alternate attackers in here, but it has some good Pokemon search, and the fact that it can accelerate energy very nicely, as you can see here, it does have the Eldegoss and Gossifleur in order to get those Pokemon and energies out. And then, like I mentioned, we have the Snorlax here, as well as the Rillaboom having the highest HP of any Stage 2 Pokemon in the theme deck format. 190 HP is huge, and it's not even able to knock out itself because its biggest attack does 180, so some very big HP Pokemon here, same with the Snorlax, so very good for that regard, and it does have some good consistency overall with the supporter lineup, as well as the trainers in general, especially things like Ordinary Rod and Pokegear, allowing you to get the cards that you really need. Going into our number 8 spot though, we have a fire deck, the first of many as you'll see. This time it is the Cinderace theme deck. Very powerful deck as it does have some extremely strong early game options, particularly in the Drampa. Dealing 80 damage for just 2 energy is going to wipe out pretty much every basic Pokemon in theme format, along with a lot of stage 1 Pokemon as well. And that Cinderace can really come in clutch in the mid to late game and sweep up any other big attackers that your opponent might have. But as we can see in the cons here, the deck is quite difficult to really make a comeback with. So if you lose your Cinderace, then it is going to be very difficult to try and win that game. You can also deck out quite easily with it because that Drampa, while it does deal 80 damage very efficiently, you do also discard the top 2 cards of your deck, so can be good for thinning out the deck as you're going to be getting towards the cards that you need, but it can also be a downside because you are decking yourself out. So overall, a very mixed bag. Can be good, but if you're not able to get it set up, then it can be very bad. But that is typically a theme with the theme deck format as a whole. Going into the 7th position here, we have a Stormcaller. I really wish I could put this deck up in a higher ranking, honestly, because this is a super fun deck to play, and if you can get going, then you're pretty much guaranteed to win every time. But unfortunately, it is lacking in a very vast amount of areas, particularly in its consistency, but we'll see that in a second in the deck list. But if we look here, it does guarantee paralysis if you can get that Ampharos set up. So the Ampharos has an ability, you can lost zone 2 energy, and the dependent Pokemon is paralyzed, which then sets up perfect knockouts, as that Ampharos does deal sniping damage if you so desire, or you can just do it to the active, but does also draw very well, although it is, like I mentioned, tricky to set up, and it does have a poor early game, as you're really relying on drawing cards. You're probably going to lose a couple of prizes early game as well while you try and get that Ampharos set up, but you have the Zeb Striker there with Sprint, and that's going to allow you to infinitely draw through your deck every single turn, as well as the Naganadel being a solid attacker, as well as allowing you to attack for a different typing, which is always a good thing. Going into our next position here, we have Towering Heights at number 6. This is the deck featuring Groudon along with the Garchomp, which is very strong. I do really enjoy playing this deck. It has an excellent comeback mechanic in that Garchomp, as you can deal more damage if you're behind on prizes, as well as just being a very efficient attacker overall. And you'd also have some great early attacks with a couple of the Pokemon that have very efficient attacks, as we'll see in a second, but as you can see, it is also slow to set up. It has bad weaknesses, things like grass weakness, water weakness, that kind of thing. Not the best overall, but for that comeback mechanic, for that early pressure that can apply it with the Palpitoad here, is very good in that regard. And you do also have a nice selection of supporter cards to work with, along with the various consistency options in the attacks, like the Pissimian, which actually has Spike Draw, allowing you to draw 2 cards and also dealing 20 damage. One of the few attacks which just draws you cards and deals damage at the same time, so I do really like it for that reason, but it has a lot of issues, like I mentioned. If you're struggling to get set up, then things typically fall apart for you. Now going into our next spot, number 5, we have Laser Focus here. This is a similar kind of situation, but I find it to be a lot more consistent, as you do have the energy acceleration of the Malamars in this deck. You also hit for relevant numbers against the Stage 2 Pokemon and any big basics like the Snorlax, as that Necrozma does deal 160 if you can get it set up, with other attacks also dealing 120. Has a pretty reliable draw engine, but it does rely on finding that special energy in order to get the big attacks off with the Necrozma. As you can see here, it does require a little bit of setup getting those Malamars out, but we do have a lot of draw options with the Audino, and we also have the Dedenne, so definitely a lot of good ways to draw cards, things like the Mysterious Treasure, certainly allowing us to search out our Psychic types very efficiently. So overall, a solid pick, certainly very fun, as you're not really going to have any bad point in the game if you can get those Malamars set up nice and early. Going into the next spot here, closing out the top 6 or so positions, 7 positions, we do have Unseen Depths. Now, I did have this at the top spot a little while ago. If you've seen that video, I had it as the best theme deck, but overall, taking into consideration the popularity of some of these other decks and the power of the other decks, this deck just unfortunately misses out on the top 3 position, as it's just not as consistent as some of these other decks. It requires a lot of setup, and if you don't get that Empoleon out when you need it, then everything can fall apart from you. But if you can get that set up, then you are able to snipe around your opponent's board and take knockouts where it matters, because this Empoleon allows you to use the attacks of previous evolutions, and one of those attacks makes it so that you can deal 100 damage to any of your opponent's Pokemon, so that can easily take out an evolution Pokemon before it's able to get set up. And in a format like this, where everything is reliant on evolving, that is going to be a very powerful attack to work with for sure. But like I mentioned, we don't have a lot of other great attacking options. Sure, they are there and you can get them rolling, but really relying on that Empoleon to get set up is a big hindrance to the deck, as if you miss out on that, then you do miss out on the victory for the most part. So other thing to note is this is one of the few decks to actually have a stadium, which is always a nice thing to note, but it can also help your opponent, so just something to keep in mind there. As we approach the top 3 positions, it is going to be the Charizard theme deck from Vivid Voltage. I have this at my number 3 spot, mainly thanks to the popularity of the deck and its overall versatility, because it can easily get big knockouts out of nowhere using the Leon, increasing your damage by 30 during that turn. So your opponent might be thinking that they're safe, but as soon as you play down that Leon, you're going to be taking a big knockout and going ahead, swinging the game in your favour. And it does also have some good consistency throughout, assuming of course that you can get the Charizards set up. But one of the main drawbacks to the deck is it does have some high attack costs. As we can see, we do have the Charizard, which is very efficient, as it is the star of the show, only attacking for 2 energy, while having a great ability allowing you to consistently draw through your deck. But all of the other Pokemons have a 3 or more attack cost, which is very frustrating to deal with, as it's going to require a lot of turns in order to get those set up. But as you can see, we do have a great selection of trainer cards in this deck as well. Going into our second position, we have Relentless Flame, the other Charizard theme deck. Obviously going to be a toss-up between those two, and Unseen Depth, of course, so this is just my preference and what I've observed, but for the most part, Relentless Flame is more consistent than the other Charizard theme decks, and as you can see here, we do have a lot of points in the pros section, as Charizard can KO anything. It does have an infinite damage cap, as you can just continuously attach energy on there and use that ability to stack energy on in order to deal infinite damage and take a knockout on any opposing Pokemon. It does also have an extremely consistent draw engine, as we'll see in a second, in addition to the great recovery options with Brock's Grit. And of course, Rapidash's agility attack does just win games if you can get those hits on the coin flip. That's going to prevent your opponent from dealing any damage to you, and of course if they can't deal damage, they can't win, and you're going to keep dealing damage to them and win yourself. The main con to the deck though is it does rely on setting multiple stage 2 Pokemon, while most theme decks just rely on the one stage 2. This deck goes all out and has 2 stage 2 Pokemon in it, and this makes it extremely difficult to get set up sometimes. Now, you do have some great draw, don't get me wrong. We have the Farfetch, which is going to draw us cards, as well as getting that Nidoqueen set up is going to be great for searching out every single Pokemon. But like I said, if you can't get those set up, you're going to be in a really, really poor position in the match, because you are trying to set up so many evolutions at the same time. Thankfully, we do have some great trainer cards, and as I mentioned, the Brock's Grit is going to allow us to recover any Pokemon that we lose through knockouts on our opponent's side, and we do also have some great draw support like Copycat and Cynthia, as well as having that Professor Kui can always be helpful in swinging the match in our favour. But going into the top position, we have to give it to Soaring Storm. This is a phenomenal deck in so many aspects, and it remains the most popular theme deck in my opinion anyway. I certainly see it the most on the ladder still, although people have certainly started to experiment with some of the other decks, hence why we have this list, of course. But looking at the pros here, we do have the best deck for drawing well. Almost every Pokemon also has a useful attack, as we'll see and discuss in a second at the deck list, but it can accelerate a lot of energy with this Dragonite. Its ability allows you to attach a water and lightning energy, and if you're lucky enough to get both Dragonite set up, that means you can attach up to 5 energy every single turn, which is insane, especially considering the fact that we have very efficient attacks that we can use. It also has some great typing, so the fact that you have lightning type attackers is going to mean that you are hitting weakness in some matchup, and it just generally doesn't have any weaknesses to any particular deck. Sure, you have things that are weak to lightning, things that are weak to fighting, but you can use an alternate attacker in those matchups. Now, of course, if we look at the cons, there is not really any early game pressure for the most part, and it does have a lot of moving parts like the Charizard deck, but for the most part we have I'd say 1 or 2 reasonable attackers for the early game, as we are focused on that Alolan Grimer to draw his cards. But if we don't have that, we're typically going in with something like Tornadus or the Thundurus, probably the Thundurus, since it does deal 70 damage for 2 energy. But even still, just getting that Dragonite out, accelerating all of the energy. You have the Pidgeotto in there, just like with the Blastoise deck that we looked at earlier, so you are going to be able to draw a lot of cards very consistently, as well as attaching all of the energy. So if you use something like a Cynthia to shuffle your hand into your deck, you're not going to be drawing into any energies because you are able to attach them all so efficiently. And we do also have some decent recovery here, as we have the energy recycler or whatever, we have that card. We have some good consistency here, as well as switches, that sort of thing. So very powerful deck, just an all-rounder that can deal damage very well, knock out all of the biggest Pokemon, and easily attack efficiently. That is the main thing that we're looking here for the top spot of the top 10 best decks, because this is going to allow us to easily and effectively knock out every single matchup that we come up against. Things like the Charizard deck, things like the Unseen Depths deck, they are very popular and they are very powerful, I'm not denying that, but they just don't have answers for every matchup, unlike this Soaring Storm deck. So that is the top 10 for me. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Let me know down below if you agree with all of these. Like I mentioned at the start, I do have a playlist where I go in depth and review each of these decks individually, along with other decks that didn't make it into the top 10. So be sure to let me know if you have a deck that you think should be in the top 10. Is there any that are underrated at the moment or that I've missed out? Let me know all of those thoughts down below, and if you are new here, you're seeing my channel for the first time, of course you should go ahead and subscribe, and whether you're new here or not, like the video as it really helps me out and it shows your support if you want to see this updated at any point, because currently we don't know the future of the theme deck format, so hopefully they do maintain it, hopefully they bring new decks in the near future, because there hasn't been any with the most recent sets, unfortunately. But that's been my top 10. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.